I'm not giving up.
I am selling the building.
The final season of FX's The Bear.
The restaurant is flooded.
Everything's either gonna be okay.
No, stop!
Or not.
We are outgunned and we are outmanned, but we have each other.
FX's The Bear, the final season. All episodes now streaming on Disney+.
When you need to build up your team to handle the growing chaos at work, use Indeed Sponsored Jobs. It gives your job post the boost it needs to be seen and helps reach people with the right skills, certifications, and more. Spend less time searching and more time actually interviewing candidates who check all your boxes. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. That's Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Need a hiring hero? This is a job for Indeed Sponsored Jobs.
The Flood of Manu. Every civilization remembers water as destroyer. In India, this memory crystallizes in the figure of Manu, the primordial lawgiver, who survives a cosmic flood with divine assistance. The narrative, preserved in the Shatapatha Brahmana and expanded in the Matsya Purana, is both simple and profound. Manu rescues life from annihilation by obeying the warning of a mysterious fish, later revealed as an incarnation of Vishnu. Seeds of every plant and creature are preserved in a boat, tethered to a mountaintop, and from this remnant, a new age of humanity begins. At first glance, the story resembles Noah's Ark, Deucalion's boat, or Utnapishtim's vessel. But the Indian version is unique in its depth and detail. It is not only about survival, but about continuity of knowledge and law. Manu is not a passive survivor, but a founder, the first king, the archetype of order, the transmitter of dharma to the next cycle of humanity. This emphasis on preserving not just life but civilization is critical. It suggests the flood was remembered not merely as a natural disaster, but as the erasure of an advanced world whose essence had to be safeguarded. The Shatapatha Brahmana text 1.8.1 tells us that Manu offered water for ritual purification, and a fish approached, asking for protection. The fish warned, "A flood will carry away all creatures, you alone shall survive." Manu nurtured the fish until it grew vast, then at the appointed time built a ship. The flood came, the fish guided the vessel to the northern mountains, and Manu's sacrifices after the deluge gave rise to a new mankind. The Matsya Purana enriches the imagery. The fish is Vishnu himself, whose horn was tied to the ship by a serpent, pulling Manu's vessel through the surging waters until it rested on the peak of the Himalayas. For the pro-Atlantis perspective, the central importance lies in three features. 1. The divine warning, as though knowledge of catastrophe was scientific, not accidental. 2. The preservation of seeds, animals, and sacred lore, suggesting more than instinct, but deliberate cultural continuity. 3. The ship guided to the mountains, a motif of relocation inland after coastal lands are destroyed. Taken literally, this is the memory of a real cataclysm, rising seas that obliterated fertile lowlands, forcing survivors to retreat to higher terrain. Taken symbolically, it is the encoding of knowledge about cycles of destruction and renewal. Either way, it preserves memory of a vanished world. Modern geology gives context. At the close of the Pleistocene, meltwater pulses caused ocean levels to rise in dramatic surges. Between 12,000 and 10,000 years ago, coastlines across South Asia were swallowed. Vast plains that once extended south of Tamil Nadu, across the Palk Strait, and into the wider Indian Ocean, vanished underwater. If a flourishing coastal civilization once existed there, as traditions of Kumari Kandam insist, it would have been devastated. The survivors would have carried their myths inland, reframing them as divine revelations. Manu's flood is not myth as metaphor, but myth as memory. The story of Manu also encodes astronomical and calendrical themes. Texts describe Manu performing sacrifices after the flood that re-establish cosmic order. In Vedic religion, sacrifice mirrors the movement of the heavens. Fire altars reflect solar cycles. Ritual sequences mirror the year. To say that Manu reinstituted sacrifice is to say he realigned humanity with cosmic time after the chaos of destruction. This is precisely what we would expect if a priestly elite survived catastrophe and sought to preserve scientific knowledge in symbolic form. Atlantis, in this reading, was not only a political state, but a knowledge system, and its survival depended on figures like Manu. The geography also matters. The texts place Manu's ship landing in the Himalayas, specifically at Mount Himavat, or in some versions, the northern mountains. This detail reflects the logic of survivors fleeing inundated coasts to retreat inland to the safety of rising terrain. Archaeology supports this. Settlements of the early Holocene in northern India appear after the period of sea level rise, as though new populations were pushing inland from drowned coasts. Myth and archaeology together form a single story. Catastrophe at sea, resettlement in the mountains, preservation of memory through law and ritual. What we see in the story of Manu is not primitive imagination, but the vestige of advanced memory. The preservation of seeds is agricultural foresight. The construction of a ship large enough to preserve life is engineering. The reinstitution of sacrifice is the restoration of science, law, and order. Manu is not a simple patriarch. He is the personification of survivors of Atlantis, those who carried its wisdom into India. Critics argue that all flood myths are the same and prove nothing, but the Indian version, in its early Vedic form, is among the oldest. Its details, the fish as divine guide, the preservation of seed, the refuge in the Himalayas, fit precisely with what we know of post-glacial flooding. The Flood of Manu, therefore, is one of the strongest candidates for a genuine cultural memory of Atlantis' destruction. Thus, our journey begins here. Manu's story is not merely religious symbolism, it is a historical key. In the following sections, we will compare it with the Mesopotamian and Greek floods, analyze the geological record of the Indian Ocean, and examine how Jacoliot reinterpreted Manu as Atlantean memory. But already, with Manu, the pattern is clear. India remembers what was lost. Atlantis survives in myth, not as fantasy, but as the coded record of catastrophe. Flood traditions are among the most widespread myths in human history. From Mesopotamia to Greece, from the Bible to Mesoamerica, the tale repeats: a mighty deluge destroys the world, a chosen survivor preserves life, and civilization begins anew. Skeptics treat this as evidence of archetypal storytelling, a universal metaphor for rebirth. But when the details align so closely, across regions so distant, another explanation rises to the surface. These stories are fragments of a shared historical memory. For a pro-Atlantis perspective, this is decisive. The Flood of Manu is not an isolated tale, but part of a global chorus, remembering the same cataclysm: the drowning of Atlantis and its maritime world. The Mesopotamian Deluge. The oldest written flood account comes from Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim recounts how the gods, angered by humanity, sent a deluge to destroy all life. The god Ea warned Utnapishtim, instructing him to build a great boat. He preserved animals and kin, and when the waters receded, the vessel came to rest on Mount Nicaea. Afterward, he released a dove, a swallow, and a raven to test if the land was dry. The parallels to Manu are striking: divine warning, construction of a ship, preservation of life, landing on a mountain, and ritual sacrifice afterward. But there is a deeper layer. The Mesopotamian flood story describes not a local river overflow, but a world-ending catastrophe. In a land defined by rivers, to imagine the whole earth drowned suggests memory of a larger disaster, perhaps one transmitted from seafaring survivors arriving from abroad. The biblical flood. The biblical story of Noah in Genesis mirrors Utnapishtim almost point for point. Noah, righteous among his generation, is commanded by God to build an ark, preserve animals, and endure 40 days of rain until the waters subside. The ark rests on the mountains of Ararat, and a dove bearing an olive branch signals the return of life. The Hebrew tale, written much later than its Mesopotamian forerunner, is part of the same narrative complex. What matters for our argument is not the theological spin, but the structural memory: divine foreknowledge, deliberate preservation, mountain refuge, and the rebirth of humanity. Like Manu, Noah is more than a survivor. He becomes the progenitor of renewed civilization. In both stories, law, order, and knowledge are carried through the flood, just as Atlantis' survivors are said to have carried their sciences to new lands, the Greek flood. In Greek tradition, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive when Zeus sends a deluge to punish humanity. Forewarned by his father Prometheus, Deucalion builds a chest or boat, and after 9 days of flood, the vessel comes to rest on Mount Parnassus. From there, the couple repopulate the world by casting stones behind them, which turn into men and women. Again, we find the familiar motifs: divine warning, vessel, mountain refuge, and repopulation. The Greek version adds the symbolism of stones becoming people, which reflects a mythologized memory of reseeding the earth with survivors. Here too, the memory of catastrophe is embedded in narrative structure. Humanity nearly erased, life saved only by those prepared. Beyond the ancient Near East and Mediterranean, flood myths are found in every continent. The Maya Popol Vuh speaks of wooden people destroyed by flood and jaguars, with only a few surviving to begin a new cycle. Polynesian traditions recall great inundations that swallowed islands. Native American myths describe floods that forced people onto mountaintops or into canoes. Chinese tradition tells of Yu the Great, who tamed the waters after a flood that nearly erased civilization. What unites these stories is not merely water, but the memory of total destruction, survival through foresight, and continuity of culture afterward. They are not generic metaphors. They carry technical details: seeds preserved, animals saved, astronomical cycles remembered, that point to specific cultural knowledge being carried across catastrophe. The skeptic's objection is predictable. Floods happen everywhere, so flood myths are inevitable. But the myths we are dealing with are not about seasonal inundations or river overflows. They are about the end of an age, the destruction of the world, the rebirth of humanity, and they are tied to precise details. Ships built with foresight, preservation of biodiversity, mountain refuges, re-establishment of law and science. These repeated patterns argue for transmission, not coincidence. From a pro-Atlantis perspective, the explanation is clear. At the end of the Ice Age, sea levels rose catastrophically, wiping out coastal settlements across the globe. Survivors of an advanced maritime civilization, Atlantis, carried their memories, rituals, and sciences into new homelands. There, their descendants encoded these events into myth, which became the sacred stories of later civilizations. Manu, Utnapishtim, Noah, Deucalion, different names, one memory, India as central witness. Among all these traditions, India stands out. The Flood of Manu is older than the biblical Noah, more detailed than Deucalion, and more closely aligned with actual geological events in the Indian Ocean basin. Its emphasis on preserving seeds and re-establishing sacrifice suggests cultural continuity, not mere survival but deliberate restoration of civilization. If Atlantis was real, then Manu's flood is its clearest echo in myth. The comparative record, then, is not redundancy, but reinforcement. When stories from Mesopotamia, Israel, Greece, India, and beyond align so precisely, they cannot be brushed aside. They point us back to the same horizon, the end of the last ice age, when rising seas destroyed a great maritime world. That is the world remembered as Atlantis. If the flood traditions of India, Mesopotamia, Greece, and beyond are echoes of one memory, then the question arises, where was the stage on which this disaster unfolded? To answer that, we turn to the Indian Ocean, a basin whose geological history and submerged landscapes speak directly to the memory encoded in myth. At the end of the last ice age, between roughly 12,000 and 7,000 years ago, the sea level rose by more than 100 meters. For peoples who lived along the fertile coasts, on broad river deltas, and perhaps upon low-lying landmasses now vanished, this was not a slow and imperceptible change, but a relentless advance of the ocean, punctuated by abrupt pulses when glacial melt surged into the seas. In this period, whole regions were swallowed. The land bridge that once linked India and Sri Lanka disappeared beneath the Palk Strait, vast plains to the south of Tamil Nadu drowned, and the shallow banks between Madagascar, The Seychelles and the Maldives became scattered archipelagos where once continuous land had stretched. For those who witnessed it, the world itself seemed to collapse into the sea, and it is precisely this trauma that found its way into stories of Manu and the destruction of Kumari Kandam. Modern science has begun to reconstruct these events with startling clarity. Core samples taken from the Indian Ocean floor reveal layers of rapid sedimentation consistent with catastrophic flooding. Bathymetric surveys show the outlines of river channels now hidden far offshore, their mouths buried beneath hundreds of feet of water. The ancient Saraswati, celebrated in the Vedas as a mighty river, flowed not only across the plains, but also into a delta that is today submerged beneath the Arabian Sea. On the eastern side of the subcontinent, similar traces of drowned river valleys have been charted off the coast of Bengal and the Andaman Shelf. These are not isolated anomalies. They are pieces of a vast jigsaw of submergence, evidence that the coastlines known to ancient peoples were radically different from those we know today. Where modern maps show endless blue, Ice Age maps would have revealed fertile coastlands, perhaps the seats of maritime settlements whose disappearance seeded the myths of lost continents. Archaeology, too, adds weight to this vision. Off the coast of Gujarat, near Dwarka, divers have reported stone structures arranged in rectilinear patterns at depths consistent with submergence during the early Holocene. At Pumpuhar in Tamil Nadu, sonar surveys have revealed U-shaped structures that resemble wharves or breakwaters, long since drowned. At Mahabalipuram, legends speak of 7 pagodas, only one of which now stands on land, the others said to lie beneath the sea. Recent underwater exploration has uncovered foundation walls that lend credence to the tale. Each of these sites may be small in itself, but together they form a pattern. Human habitation existed on coasts that were later overwhelmed, and the memory of those lost cities has persisted for millennia. The drowned world is not fantasy, it is archaeology awaiting systematic excavation. The catastrophe of the Indian Ocean was not only the slow creep of rising water, but sudden surges that left unforgettable scars. Geologists recognize Meltwater Pulse 1A, an event around 11,500 years ago when sea level rose by several meters within centuries, perhaps even decades. Imagine the ocean advancing inland by kilometers in a single human lifetime. Villages and farmlands would have vanished, and with them the sense of permanence that coastal societies had built over generations. The survivors would have fled inland, carrying with them not only seeds and tools, but also the terror of a world that could be undone. When these memories were later encoded into religious texts, they naturally took the form of divine judgment, of floods sent by gods, of vessels preserved by providence. Yet behind the divine language lies the geological truth. Sea level rise of staggering scale and speed. One must also consider the possibility of seismic and volcanic events amplifying this drama. The Indian Ocean sits atop active tectonic zones. Earthquakes can trigger tsunamis, as witnessed in 2004 when towering waves devastated the coasts from Sumatra to India. If such an event struck in the early Holocene, when communities were clustered along now submerged coasts, the destruction would have seemed absolute. Legends of lands sinking in a single day and night, such as Plato's description of Atlantis, need not be dismissed as hyperbole. They may reflect tsunami events that obliterated entire regions in moments. Subduction zones along the Sunda Arc, volcanic islands like Krakatoa, and rift valleys beneath the ocean floor all testify to the potential for catastrophic upheaval. Even if sea level rise was the great backdrop, earthquakes and tsunamis provided the sudden blows that cemented the memory and myth. It is in this context that the myths of India gain their full force. The story of Manu's flood is not an isolated imagination, but part of a cultural memory of a very real geological sequence. The Puranic cycles of destruction and renewal echo not abstract philosophy, but lived history, floods that erased landscapes, forcing humanity to begin again. The Tamil tradition of Kumari Kandam, which speaks of a great southern land drowned by the sea, becomes not a fanciful invention but a mythologized recollection of drowned coasts south of India. The repeated association of floods with the preservation of knowledge, seeds, law, ritual, points to the survival of cultural elites who transmitted the sciences of a lost maritime world. When we place this evidence alongside Plato's Atlantis, the parallels sharpen. Plato describes a powerful maritime civilization destroyed by a flood and earthquake, its survivors leaving only memory. The Indian Ocean provides a geological theatre for precisely such an event. Fertile plains drowned, coastal cities lost, peoples displaced, myths encoded. Atlantis need not be sought only in the Atlantic, for its essence is not in a compass direction, but in the memory of a global catastrophe. India, with its depth of tradition and its drowned coastlines, preserves this essence with particular clarity. Thus, catastrophe in the Indian Ocean is no longer speculative. It is written in submerged river valleys, in ruins beneath the sea, in the sudden rise of waters recorded in geological strata, and in the enduring myths of Manu and Kumari Kandam. To speak of Atlantis in India is not to wander into fantasy, but to confront the undeniable evidence that a vast maritime world was destroyed at the dawn of the Holocene. The survivors remembered, and their descendants wrote those memories into the scriptures and epics we still read today. Science and myth converge here, not as enemies, but as two languages telling the same story: a world drowned, a civilization shattered, and the seed of Atlantis preserved in India. When Louis Jacoliot studied the Indian traditions of Manu, he did not treat them as parables or moral allegories. He read them as fragments of a vast historical memory, remnants of an ancient civilization destroyed by the sea. His conviction was that India's myths, when stripped of poetic ornament, pointed directly to the catastrophe remembered by Plato as the fall of Atlantis. Where others dismissed the story of Manu as symbolic of cosmic order or as a local echo of Mesopotamian floods, Jacoliot insisted it was an Indian testimony of the same disaster that swept away a maritime world at the close of the Ice Age. For him, Manu was not a solitary patriarch, but the surviving leader of a shattered people, a figure who safeguarded not only the biological seeds of life, but the intellectual seeds of civilization. Jacoliot drew attention to the way the Manu tradition emphasized preservation of order and law. Unlike Noah, who survives primarily by faith, or Deucalion, who survives through paternal warning, Manu is remembered as the transmitter of Dharma, the foundation of cosmic and social order. To Jacoliot, this detail suggested that the flood did not merely erase primitive communities, but obliterated an organized advanced society whose structures of science, ritual, and governance had to be carried forward into the new age. The very fact that Manu becomes the archetype of kingship in India, the first lawgiver from whom future dynasties trace legitimacy, convinced Jacoliot that the memory encoded here was of Atlantis, a great priest kingdom where sacred law and civil order were united. When it fell, its survivors re-established that order in India, and Manu became the mythologized form of their leader. Central to Jacoliot's reading was the geographical logic of the Indian Ocean. He saw that India's coastlines held traditions of drowned lands: Kumari Kandam in the Tamil south, Dwarka in Gujarat, Mahabalipuram on the eastern shore. He argued that these were not isolated local stories, but expressions of the same event described in Plato: a sudden catastrophe, a land lost to the waves, a civilization forced to scatter. By naming this drowned world Rutas, Jacoliot sought to anchor the Indian evidence within the broader Atlantean tradition. His Rutas was not a speculative continent born of zoological puzzles, as Lemuria had been. It was an Atlantis situated in the Indian Ocean, remembered in Indian scripture, preserved in coastal legends, and waiting to be rediscovered beneath the sea. In his interpretation, the fish that warns Manu is not a whimsical detail, but a cipher. Fish are the dwellers of the sea, the natural guardians of drowned lands. For Jacoliot, Matsya, the fish form of Vishnu, symbolized the voice of a people whose lives were bound to the sea. navigators and mariners who foresaw the coming disaster. The horn of the fish, to which Manu's ship is tied, became in his reading the emblem of advanced knowledge, astronomy, geometry, calendrics, that guided the survivors safely through catastrophe. Where scholars of his day treated the fish as a religious allegory, Jacoliot read it as a clue to Atlantis's maritime identity, a civilization of sailors and priests who preserved life through ships when their homeland sank. Jacoliot's interpretation was bold, but in light of modern discoveries, it appears less fanciful than critics claimed. The submergence of Dwarka, the sonar finds off Pumpuhar, the geological record of rapid sea level rise, all confirm that India's coasts witnessed events precisely of the kind Manu's myth describes. Jacoliot may have lacked the science to prove it, but he intuited that myth and geology were two sides of the same coin. He insisted that the Indian Ocean, not merely the Atlantic, was a key theatre of the Atlantean story. In doing so, he planted the seed for a broader vision of Atlantis, not as a single island alone, but as a cultural horizon spanning oceans with India as its eastern heir. His interpretation also extended to the continuity of priesthoods. Just as Plato described Atlantis as ruled by kings, who were also priests of Poseidon, Jacoliot saw Manu's survival and the subsequent rise of Brahmin authority as evidence of an Atlantean priestly legacy. The rituals of fire, the cycles of sacrifice, the meticulous astronomical observations embedded in Vedic hymns. To him, these were not spontaneous inventions, but the preserved sciences of Atlantis, transplanted onto Indian soil. This was why the Manu tradition mattered so much in his theory. It was not a tale of mere survival, but of the deliberate preservation of sacred science across catastrophe. Atlantis, in this reading, did not die. It changed form, carried forward by its priest-scientists who became the rishis and Brahmins of India. One can see why later occultists and theosophists seized on Jacoliot's ideas, but it is important to strip away the layers of esoteric fantasy and return to the core insight. He was right that myth encodes memory, that the Indian Ocean witnessed massive inundations, and that the figure of Manu is best understood not as parable, but as remembrance. His flaw was exaggeration, his weakness invention, but his guiding conviction that the Indian tradition is a witness to Atlantis remains compelling. Today, with archaeology and geology on our side, we can revisit his interpretation and reframe it with evidence. Where he spoke of rutas in general terms, we can point to submerged plains, drowned river valleys, and offshore ruins. Where he spoke of priestly survivals, we can trace astronomical knowledge embedded in the Vedas. Where he spoke of the fish avatar as symbol, we can recognize the maritime character of a civilization dependent on ships. Thus, Jacoliot's interpretation of the Flood of Manu is more than a curiosity of 19th century speculation. It is an early articulation of what this book sets out to prove, that the Indian traditions are direct heirs to the Atlantean memory. The catastrophe remembered in Manu's story was the same catastrophe remembered by Plato, by Mesopotamia, by Greece, by the Bible. Its epicenter may have lain in the Indian Ocean, its survivors may have taken refuge in India's river valleys and mountains, and its sciences may have been preserved in Vedic ritual and Brahminical law. In re-examining Manu through this lens, we do not merely revive Jacoliot's theory, we strengthen it with the weight of modern evidence, transforming speculation into the beginning of proof.